fortunate to have William Martin. He's obviously very popular. How many of you have read any of his books? Across a career that spans 3 decades, New York Times best-selling author William Martin has written 10 novels, an award-winning PBS film on the life of George Washington, book reviews, magazine articles, and a horror movie that's now considered a cult classic. His novels, including Back Bay, Cape Cod, and City of Dreams, have chronicled American history from the Pilgrims to 9/11 and established him, in the words of Publishers Weekly, as a storyteller whose smoothness equals his ambition. A favorite of Cape Cod readers, he was the 2005 recipient of the prestigious New England Book Award, given to an author, quote, whose body of work stands as a significant contribution to the culture of the region, unquote. He's been traveling the country giving presentations across New England, in the Atlanta area, at the famed Miami Book Fair, and most recently at the Library of Congress. After his presentation, he'll be happy to sign the Lincoln Letter and or any of his other books that Bookends has sent us in paperback. There will be time for questions after the presentation. William Martin has been a favorite here at the Jenks Center for many years, and I hope you will join me in giving him a big welcome.
There was fog in Washington yesterday, which meant that everybody's flights out of D.C. yesterday was 4 hours late. But I'm glad to be here, glad to have made it through the traffic and so forth. Google is all messed up on how to get to Woburn, how to get to this spot, or I'm in Winchester. They push you, they have you go through Woburn. I'm coming from Weston. It seemed wrong, but anyway, enough of all that. Abraham Lincoln and me. Somebody went to a book signing recently. I was happy about this. I liked it. And he bought a copy of this book from me. And he went in and he said to the bookseller, wow, William Martin and Abraham Lincoln, that's like vanilla and fudge sauce. I thought that was a pretty good description. Who am I? The best description of who I am probably comes from one of my sons. He was about 6 years old, sitting in the backyard with a couple of friends. The kids were talking about what their parents did for a living. And one little girl said, well, my mommy's a doctor, and she goes to the hospital every day and makes people better. And another little boy said, my daddy's a lawyer, and he goes to court every day and puts people in jail. And my son said, my daddy's a writer, and he goes up into the attic every day and makes stuff up. Which is basically true. I make stuff up. However, as you know, I make stuff up based upon history and based upon reality. I write novels in which you have a modern set of characters who are usually going in search of some lost artifact. These have been the Peter Fallon novels. And that would be Back Bay, Harvard Yard, Lost Constitution, City of Dreams, and now the Lincoln Letter. And the journeys of these characters to find these lost artifacts take them into history. And when they go into history, the history comes to life. This genre has been around for a while, of course, and has become particularly popular with guys like Steve Berry and Dan Brown and all of those people. I call it the really smart guy goes looking for lost stuff genre. But as I said to Steve Berry one day, you know, Steve, he's written a lot of these books. Some of you may have read them. I may be only a few years older than you are, and you've been around in this business and done very well in it for about 10 years, but I invented this genre 32 years ago with Back Bay, in which a really smart young graduate student goes searching for a lost Paul Revere tea set. But the difference in my books, of course, is that the history does come to life in front of you. So I consider myself more a historical fiction author than I do an author of mystery or suspense, even though I need to have that in my novels. So people ask me a lot about historical fiction. Well, how much is true in your books? How much isn't? Where's the difference? Where's the cutoff point? And why should I read one of your books when I could sit down and read the real history? And I say, well, first of all, you must remember what Gore Vidal once said, that those who get their history from historical fiction get the history they deserve. But I add this. When you think of the Wars of the Roses, if you ever think of the Wars of the Roses, do you think of Holinshed's Chronicles, or do you think a horse, my kingdom for a horse? And when you think of the French Revolution, do you think of Simon Schama's great book, Citizens, or do you think it was the best of times, it was the worst of times? And when you think of Sherman's March to the Sea, do you think of the cold analysis of the British military historian Sir Basil Liddell Hart, who wrote, Sherman's objective in cutting a swath of destruction across the state of Georgia was to prove to the Confederacy that not only could the North destroy the military superstructure of Confederate resistance, they could also destroy the economic foundations, or do you think, as God is my witness, I'll never go hungry again? I used that line in Atlanta recently and got a big hand. You read historical fiction for the people, the plots, and the poetry. When I write it for the people, the plots, and I drop the poetry out. The poetry will take care of itself. The people, the plots, and the places. Those of you who have read my books or even read the titles of them know that place has a significant impact upon what I write, why I write, and in essence, how I write, how I bring stories to life. They emerge quite often from place, from location. Back Bay, Cape Cod, Annapolis, Harvard Yard. The Lost Constitution was originally called the New Englanders. City of Dreams, the one set in New York City. All of them are about place because we are about the places that we migrate to, that we inhabit, that we build, that we destroy, and that we choose to preserve. And I think that that's always part of the American story. It's always part of the human story. And so when I sit down to write a book, I add place. Now, the Lincoln letter, let's start with the plot, the first of the 3 Ps. The Lincoln letter, excuse me, need a little coffee. The Lincoln letter has a simple plot. Abraham Lincoln is writing one night in his diary in the telegraph office. You know, Lincoln every night for all those years, and a couple of times during the day, would walk out of the White House, just walk across the lawn, through the trees, and into the War Department, which was on the site, on Pennsylvania Avenue, on the site of the old executive office building of today. And he'd sit down in the telegraph office on the 2nd floor and wait for the news to come in from the battlefronts. And he'd chat with the young men who were there working, and quite often he would stay up all night if the news was of particular importance. And in my novel, he's writing in his diary while he's waiting for the news. He's writing his thoughts about the need for emancipation and its potential consequences. And, of course, the diary is fictional. I sat down with Doris Kearns Goodwin, whom I've known for years, and asked her when I was getting this book started, what would you think if the lost artifact in this book was a Lincoln diary? And she said, a Lincoln diary? And she almost levitated from the chair. Can you imagine the value of such a thing? The financial value of it, the historical value to scholars? It would be amazing. And we know, of course, that Lincoln jotted notes to himself on little pieces of paper that he'd shove into his pockets and put into his desk drawers and things like that. His own valet, William Slade, who appears in the movie. How many of you have seen the movie? Yeah, a lot. Wow. His valet, William Slade, admitted later that he burned these things on a regular basis. He'd empty the president's pockets and burn everything in the stove. So what if all of that stuff had been collected in a diary? I said, Doris, if it's good enough for you, it's good enough for me. And so that's the focus. Lincoln leaves his diary on a desk in the War Department. A young officer who's working all night says, oh my God, the president left his diary. And he picks it up and puts it in his pocket, saying to himself, I'll get this back to the president in the morning. Bad decision. But bad decisions make great stories. The rest of the story will follow that young man and the diary through history, from 1862 to 1865. And in the modern story, and you know a modern story runs in parallel, Peter Fallon, the main character in now 5 of my novels, comes across a Lincoln letter, hence the title, that suggests that maybe there's something in Washington still that nobody's found that has a lot to do with Lincoln and would be worth a lot of money. So Peter Fallon decides it's time to get to Washington. There's the place, Washington, D.C., the sleek, modern, beautiful capital that all of you know, city that I was just in for a couple of days and always loved to visit. Gore Vidal called it the Federal Theme Park a few years ago, when he was talking about all of the museums, and we had a wonderful time wandering the museums and visiting Ford's Theater and so forth. And of course visiting the Library of Congress yesterday. And then of course there's the other Washington that I bring to life for you, the Washington of 1862. This was the city that just 10 years before Dickens had called the city of great distances, with broad avenues beginning nowhere and ending in nothing, with great white half-baked limestone wedding cake buildings sitting atop the hills surrounded by rubble. Dickens didn't like Washington too much. He didn't like New York too much either. The only American city that appealed to him in the least was Boston. And he stayed for quite some time at the Parker House. A few years later, Washington, D.C. was a city at war, a besieged capital, a city that was, as the Civil War unfolded, the most fortified city in the world, surrounded by a ring of forts to protect this city from the Confederates on one side and the potential rebels in Maryland, the people who had been opposing Lincoln from the beginning, who might also slip in from that direction. The population of the city doubled in a year between the beginning of the war and 1862. So the New York diarist George Templeton Strong, who went down to visit for a while, would say this in 1862, of all the detestable places, Washington is the first. Crowds, noise, heat, bad food, bad quarters, bad smells, a plague of flies upon everything. Beelzebub surely reigns in Washington, D.C., and the Willard Hotel is his headquarters. The Willard Hotel was on the site of the Willard Hotel today, Pennsylvania and 14th. It was a 4-story building that wrapped around the corner and was the most popular gathering spot in the city. The congressmen and senators could come down just a mile for a quick drink or a lunch or a dinner. And all of the other people who had come to Washington for all of those reasons, the population had doubled, all of them would go to the lobby of the Willard Hotel and see what they could find out. They might listen from behind newspapers, they might buttonhole a politician, they might buy him a drink, they might buy his assistant a drink. There was business going on in the lobby of the Willard Hotel, and so much business, in fact, that in time the term lobbyist would emerge as a result of the Willard Hotel. But all of those people who gathered at the Willard Hotel for lunch or dinner or drinks or rumor mongering began their day at the White House. My main character, Halsey Hutchinson, comes out of the War Department with the president's diary in his pocket that first morning that the story begins. He's thinking, maybe I can get into the White House right now and give the diary back to the president. So he walks out of the War Department, then takes the path through the trees to the White House carriage drive. And they were already lining up, as they did each dawn. Office seekers, favor seekers, friends, relatives, relatives of relatives, men bearing letters of introduction, women bearing petitions of mercy, widows, orphans, inventors, scoundrels, scalawags, the sons of scalawags, the sons of rich men too, all waiting for 9 o'clock, when the White House would officially open and they would crowd in under the portico, into the foyer, up the stairs, and if they were lucky, all the way to the reception room outside the president's office, their petitions in one hand, their business cards in the other, their expectations high that before the day ended, the president himself would summon them to a personal audience and satisfy their petition or solve their problem. That is the longest sentence I have ever written. I still can't read it on one tank of air, but what I was trying to get across to you was the crush, the force of these people pushing forward, pushing up the stairs, all of them seeking favor for themselves or their relatives. All of these people, these were the people of Washington, opportunists, backstabbers, self-seekers, and you know, it sounds an awful lot like the Washington of today. It was said that at the beginning, Lincoln had spent most of his day with these people. His secretaries had imposed some order on the process so that he could put in a proper day's work, but he still insisted on seeing them. He called it his public opinion bath. That was the kind of people that inhabited this Washington, D.C. Public health issues were enormous. Any of you who have read the book know that I make a fairly big point about that. In fact, if you want to talk about public health, consider this. Abraham Lincoln's own son, Willie, in February of 1862, died of typhoid. His second son, Tad, also contracted it. Many other people in the city had it. Why would Willie and Tad have gotten typhoid? Well, of course, they were drinking water that was piped straight from the Potomac. And, of course, there were two huge armies somewhere up the river with their men and their livestock dumping effluent into the river and the tributaries. And, of course, it was just a natural outcome that people who drank water from the Potomac might get sick. As for the city itself, well, we've heard what Dickens had to say about it, and George Templeton Strong. The Capitol was uncompleted. There was a dirty, smelly canal that cut up from the Anacostia River, ran around the base of Capitol Hill, then took a westerly turn, running out along the line of what is today Constitution Avenue. It was not a very pleasant sight, Washington, D.C. Here's what Halsey sees as he walks along Pennsylvania Avenue. He takes that left from 15th Street in front of the Treasury and comes around the corner to the place where the Pennsylvania Avenue left the executive branch and resumed its diagonal run toward Capitol Hill. And as the panoply opened before him, his thought was always the same. If this was the grandest thoroughfare in Washington, it did not bode well for the Republic. Its width befit a street of high ambition in the capital of an ambitious nation, and it was lined with trees and buildings, and it was angled so as to draw the eye toward that fine distant prospect, the hill atop which sat the national legislature. But width merely afforded more room for mud to spurt up through cracked cobblestones, for pigs and fowl to run wild, for wagons and omnibuses to break down. It also separated the respectable activities of the North Side, hotels, theaters, and businesses, from the area called Murder Bay, a triangle of land formed by Pennsylvania on the north, the canal on the south, and 15th Street on the west, and into which were crammed enough saloons, dance halls, gambling hells, and bordellos to satisfy every corps in the Army of the Potomac should they all go on leave at once. That, by the way, is now known as the Federal Triangle, inhabited by the IRS, the FBI, and the best that could be said of the trees was that when they leafed out, they performed the aesthetic miracle of blocking most of the ramshackle buildings from view. As for the pillared Capitol, it appeared as if someone had stuck a giant egg beater in its roof to mix up whatever was inside. Construction of a dome had begun in 1859, but the war had stopped it. Now the crane holding up the cast iron ribs resembled the beater handle, and the ribs looked like the paddles. But the work had resumed. The president had insisted. He said that finishing the dome would symbolize the continuity of the nation. In a city of bleak reality, thought Halsey, hopeful symbols had their place. That's the city. That's the place. But now the people who are significant, and I don't mean the fictional characters, you'll meet them and become involved with them. And as you know in my novels, my fictional characters serve as stand-ins for all of you and me, and foils for history. People, in fact, who sort of draw history out a little bit and make it come to life before us. From the time that I was a boy, I loved those novels in which the main character, the fictional character, got close to history. The first book that I can remember reading that really got me excited about this was a book, an obscure Western called No Survivors, by a guy who wrote novels in the 40s and 50s by the name of Will Henry. It's about Custer's last stand, and about a fictional scout who rides with Custer, and comes the morning of June 25th, 1876, Custer is on the ridge looking down into Medicine Tail Coulee, and the scout is on his horse next to Custer, and he looks at Custer and he says, "I wouldn't ride down there if I were you, General. I got a really bad feeling about this." And I was excited by historical fiction from that point on, because what you were seeing in that scene was history before it becomes history. When there's still a chance for the main character of history to make his decision, and all good storytelling is about decisions. It's about characters making choices that drive a story in a certain direction, and history is the same way. About those two characters at that moment, and one of them could make a decision that would change history entirely, certainly for those 200 plus men that rode with Custer down into that valley. The same thing in this novel. I have my fictional characters, and they look into the eyes of history. In the first chapter, you'll look into the eyes of Lincoln, and then my main character there on that little walk down Pennsylvania Avenue walks up to a shoe shine stand in front of the National Hotel, which is where all of the officers from the War Department stayed. He sits down, and who walks out the front door and sits down on the shining chair next to him? But a man who was staying at the National Hotel at that time, just before he traveled up here to Boston to do some theatrical performances, John Wilkes Booth. Later you will meet Fernando Wood, who is the minority whip in the movies, and so many of you have seen it, the one who does most of the arguing for the Democratic side, Fernando Wood. Very interesting. This character, who is such a significant player in the movie, based upon Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, gets only one mention in the index of Doris Kearns Goodwin's book. But the dramatists looked at Fernando Wood and said, this guy was a real scallywag. This guy had been the mayor of New York City in January of 1861 when secession began, and he suggested to the people of New York that maybe we can be neutral in this. Maybe we can just stay out of this. Why? He wanted New York to be an open port where the flow of textiles and cotton would continue. And of course, he would control the patronage. That character was defeated in New York, ran for Congress, and ended up not only in the movie, but in my novel. It's interesting how dramatists think, or novelists. We're looking for guys who are foils, who are strong opposition to our major characters, and Fernando Wood is one of them. His brother Benjamin is just as bad. You can meet him in the book too. You'll meet Oliver Wendell Holmes. Clara Barton makes a cameo appearance on the battlefield at Antietam. Walt Whitman pops in, very significant character in the book, and a very significant experience getting to know Walt Whitman. But most importantly, there is Lincoln. We get to look into the eyes of the man of contradictions. That's the best thing that I can, the best way that I can describe him. He was a simple country lawyer who was the shrewdest politician in the room. He could not stand the sight of blood, and yet he prosecuted the bloodiest war in American history. He was a constitutional scholar and constitutional expert who suspended constitutional rights more than once in order to preserve his vision of a constitutional union. He was a guy who loved to tell a funny story or hear one and loved to laugh, and yet he carried his sadness around on his shoulders like a shawl. And perhaps most significantly for this novel about the Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln was a 19th century white male with the racial and racist attitudes of the 19th century white male who became the greatest enemy of slavery and the great emancipator. These are significant contradictions. But let's just look at that business about the slavery and the racism. In 1858, in his Lincoln-Douglas debates, he said that he did not believe that the Negro would ever be the intellectual equivalent of the white man. He also said that he believed that the state of Illinois' laws against interracial marriage were firm and should be upheld. And as late as 1862, Abraham Lincoln, Civil War is underway by now, the cataclysm has begun. Abraham Lincoln will call into his office a delegation of freed slaves, 7 of them. As a black character in my book says, this is the first time that black men have ever gone in the front door of the White House without first holding it for the white men. Lincoln has them sit down and says to them, slavery is the greatest evil ever perpetrated by one race upon another. But across this broad land, there is not a single member of your race who is placed upon this level of equivalency with a single member of my race. Would it not be better if we separated? He then proposed that these 7 freed slaves lead a delegation, lead a migration of freed slaves back to Central America or to Africa. When word of this got out, of course, Frederick Douglass was infuriated. William Lloyd Garrison, the great abolitionist from Boston, fulminated in his newspaper, The Liberator, that these people were born here as Americans and deserved to die in the due course of nature here as Americans. Nevertheless, what Lincoln was uttering was a position that had been widely accepted amongst some very liberal thinking anti-slavery people from the beginning of the 19th century, that once the slaves were freed, there would be no living together, there would be no integration with them. What there would be, at best, would be a separation, and that would be the thing that we should all hope for them. We'll give them some money and send them on their way. That was the idea. But remember, Lincoln's presidency, like most presidencies, is a learning curve, and that learning curve has already begun. Because the other part about Lincoln was that he hated slavery. He might not have believed in the intellectual equivalence of the blacks to the whites, but he certainly believed in their moral equivalence. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he had said, we are hypocrites if we believe or propose to believe in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We are hypocrites if we believe that, and yet enslave 10% of our population for profit. At one point he actually said, I would just as soon, if that is the case, go to Russia, where they make no pretense at enslaving their people. So he opposed slavery as an intellectual concept. He also opposed it on deeper levels as well. He only ever talks about the cruelties of slavery once or twice. It's the same incident, and he writes about it twice. He and his friend Joshua Speed, who turns out to be a vampire in Lincoln the Vampire Slayer, or a friend of his. I watched that movie the other night, just had to see it. Dreadful. shouldn't even mention it. Craptastic is a word that was invented for that movie. He wrote to his friend Joshua Speed about a trip that they had taken as young men down the Mississippi River. And he had seen 15 young black males chained together at the bow of the boat. Their freedoms taken away from them for no other reason but the color of their skin. 15 young males chained together, as he wrote, like fish on a stringer. That sight haunted me then and haunts me still, is what he said in the early 1860s. As he also said, I have always been against slavery. If slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. And when he became president, his intent was to stop the spread of slavery into the unincorporated territories. But on March 4th, 1861, that young man, that young Lincoln, with the dark black beard that he had just grown, a vital 52-year-old man, stood in front of the audience, in front of the unfinished Capitol dome, and said that he had no intention of interfering with the rights of the Southern slaveholders in their states. Neither he nor anybody else could see what was coming, could imagine what was coming. And that 4 years later, they would be looking at the complete end of slavery. But you will see in this novel Lincoln working his way through the writing of the Emancipation Proclamation, a political tract as much as a moral tract. Remember, a man of contradictions, a man always concerned with the political reality as well as the grand idealistic vision of a thing. And the Emancipation Proclamation, of course, only frees the slaves in the states that are in rebellion, because Lincoln, issuing this executive order under his war powers as commander-in-chief, does not believe that the Constitution allows him to go any further. He knows that as the war ends, that executive order can be rescinded by the next president. That's why he pushes that 13th Amendment. Emancipation Proclamation is an enormously significant moment in American history. But it was rooted in the reality, the political realities of the time and the moment. Go and read it. See how Lincoln, even in the preliminary proclamation, still talking about colonization. Go and see the other things that are in it. He's going to allow blacks to enlist. Those 100,000 blacks who will enlist will become a significant part of the Union Army. And that will be part of the learning curve for Lincoln, watching their performance in the field. So will coming to know Frederick Douglass be part of the learning curve. The book leaves Lincoln in 1862 with the Emancipation Proclamation. But you can't really talk about Lincoln's passage toward 1865 and the second inaugural, where we'll see him again through the eyes of Walt Whitman, except that we add some discussion about 1864. By then, the summer of 1864, the war is going badly for the Union. The potential re-election of Abraham Lincoln is in question. A group of Republicans come to the White House and say to Lincoln, Mr. President, you might still win this election if you'll just back off on this emancipation business a little bit. But by now, Lincoln has traveled much farther along that arc than he had been in 1858 or even in 1862. He knows Frederick Douglass. He knows of his intellectual capacity. He knows of the bravery of those 100,000 men in the field. The story of the Massachusetts 54th with Battery Wagner is something that you probably all know. And there were many more incidents like that. And he says to that delegation that comes to him, my objective in this war is to preserve the Union. But no power on earth could put down this rebellion without using the emancipation lever, as I have done. Very interesting word. Remember, I said he was a politician. Politicians press levers. Politicians take advantage of the things that are in front of them, the tools that are in front of them, including emancipation, in order to achieve their objectives. The emancipation lever, as I have done. But if I send those 100,000 troops back to slavery, I will be damned in time and eternity. He then insisted that the 13th Amendment become a plank in the platform of the Republican Party of 1864, even if he lost, because as he knew, the Emancipation Proclamation could be rescinded, a constitutional amendment could not. And that was where he was headed. At that point, he would call it the king's cure for all the evils, the total eradication of slavery. And he achieved it. It didn't look like Lincoln would win the 1864 election until he got a telegram from General Sherman on September 1st. Atlanta is ours, and fairly won. Lincoln won the election. March of 1865, 4 years after that first speech in front of the assembled multitudes on the uncompleted Capitol Dome, the dome is now done, grand and white, as Walt Whitman writes, and as he says in the book. I like looking at it. It comforts me somehow. Imagine, the grandeur of it today is still striking. My wife and I were walking around on Capitol Hill yesterday. The grandeur of it today is still striking in a society where monumental architecture is much more commonplace. Think of the impact that the site of that dome must have had in 1865. And now Lincoln, who looks a lot different than he did 4 years earlier, he's aged 25 years in 4 years, stands in front of the audience and talks about slavery as the cause of this war. But not Southern slavery, American slavery, because North and South have suffered enormously. We all know it's the bloodiest war in American history. Close to 700,000 men have died, countless civilians. It was American slavery. And don't forget, American slavery means North and South. The first evidence, documentary evidence, of a named slave in the New World comes in a ledger book that was written in 1638 in a place you may all be familiar with, the one-room schoolhouse over on Mass Ave that became Harvard College. And of course, the northern textile manufacturers had done quite well through the 1840s and 50s with that supply of cheap cotton that had flowed from the South. So, it was American slavery, a sin North and South. Fondly do we hope and fervently do we pray that this scourge of war may speedily pass away. But if the Lord wills that 250 years of the bondsman's labor shall be sunk, if every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be answered by another drawn with the sword, so it was said 3,000 years ago and must be said today, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. The sin is on all of our heads. The expiation of blood is complete. Then in the last paragraph, he speaks of the task ahead, with malice toward none, with charity for all. That night, he met Frederick Douglass, who came to the reception at the White House, and he asked Douglass, "What did you think of the speech?" And Douglass said, "It was not a political tract, sir. It was a sermon. It was a sacred effort." Most Americans believe that, but standing on the pediment directly behind him that night, that day, looking down at him, and you can see him in the photographs if you know what you're looking for, was the actor John Wilkes Booth. A month later, Booth would be in the audience again when Lincoln gave a speech from the window on the second floor of the White House above the front door. The speech in which he attempted to present to an audience that was expecting a barn burner, a big rousing speech about victory, when Lincoln presented a long, slow, and careful piece of legal reasoning about the challenges of Reconstruction, including the need to give the vote to those 100,000 black troops who had fought so bravely. Booth, at that line, whispered into the ear of Lewis Powell, who was right next to him. Lewis Powell, one of his co-conspirators. "That means Negro," he used a different word, "that means Negro citizenship. That is the last speech he will ever give. I will put him through." And so he did. The book, in the first one of the early chapters, includes a scene with Peter Fallon, where Peter, just before he takes off to Washington, looks at his collection of Lincoln material, because not only is Peter a dealer in rare books and documents, he is also a collector. And he looks at a letter that he has recently bought that he considers one of the most poignant letters ever written in America. A surgeon named Curtis of the U.S. Army Medical Corps had written it to his mother in April of 1865. He had gone to the White House on the morning after Lincoln had kept his appointment with the assassin. He had gone to perform the autopsy. The letter described a room on the second floor across the hall from Mrs. Lincoln's bedroom, a bed, heavy draperies, a wardrobe, sofas occupied by officers and civilian officials in stunned, grief-stricken silence, and the naked body of the president, covered with a sheet and towels, lying cold and dead on a board suspended between two sawhorses. It was a letter of stark clinical detail. The doctor had been performing a primitive forensic analysis after all. He described the removal and dissection of Lincoln's brain and the search for the bullet, which he could not find until, as he wrote, suddenly, it dropped through my fingers and fell, breaking the silence of the room with its clatter into an empty basin beneath. There it lay upon the white china, a little black mass no bigger than the end of my finger, dull, motionless, harmless, yet the cause of such mighty changes in the world's history as perhaps we may never realize. If ever you doubt that human beings make history rather than the other way around, think of how different America might have looked had Lincoln lived, particularly in the second half of the 19th century. But then think of how different America would have looked had Lincoln never lived. When I wrote this book, I came to a point where I realized that if I didn't work for about 9 months straight, 12 to 14-hour days, I wasn't going to finish in time to publish it in September of this year for the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. So I just started staying up late. Finally, one midnight, the carriage pulls up in front of Ford's Theater, and I look up at Ford's Theater and I say, oh good, I've made it finally to this scene. I guess I can go to bed now. At which point the door of the Star Saloon banged open. John Wilkes Booth walked up the street, turned, and remember what I said about looking history in the eye. He turned and looked me in the eyes and said, you don't want to go to bed yet, Bill. Come on inside and see what's going to happen next. And I stayed up all night to write that scene, and I think that when you get to that scene, you'll stay up all night too. So thank you all for listening. Lincoln was very careful about his perceptions of the Constitution. When he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, stated that he was issuing it under his powers as Commander-in-Chief, that it was an executive order. He did that on September 22nd. 2 days later, he issued an order stating that he issued this through Secretary Stanton, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War, now the Secretary of Defense. He stated that anyone who impeded the efforts or discouraged the efforts to raise another 300,000 men in the federal draft, newspaper editors, people in the street, politicians, anyone was subject to arrest. This is a suspension of the First Amendment to the Constitution. Lincoln had also, in the first month of the war, suspended the writ of habeas corpus, particularly for the state of Maryland. It extended through the whole country, but what Lincoln was facing, of course, was a possibility that if the Maryland legislature met and voted for secession and seceded from the Union, and that was quite possible. Had they done that, because several of the most significant figures in Baltimore were secessionists, the city of Washington would have been untenable. It would have been surrounded by a rebel territory. And so Lincoln, at that point, and the Constitution allows him to do this, in times of rebellion, the writ of habeas corpus, that anyone who's arrested must be brought before a judge or justice within a certain length of time, except in times of rebellion. Lincoln suspended the writ and then went to Congress, called Congress back into session, and at that point got the approval of Congress, because he was supposed to have the approval of Congress. But it's that second decision that basically suspended civil liberties in the North. That's the more significant one, I think. And some 3,000 people were imprisoned in the North during the Civil War, newspaper editors, writers, political opponents of one form or another. Some of them might be imprisoned for a day or two, some of them for somewhat longer. But that had a chilling effect. And there are lots of other stories like this. For example, Benjamin Wood, the brother that I was, the congressman I was just mentioning. Well, there were two of them, the Wood brothers. One of them was the mayor of New York. One of them was a congressman from New York initially. They both ended up as congressmen. And Benjamin Wood owned the New York Daily News. And he hated Lincoln more than his brother did. And he and the brother were extreme racists. They saw the Civil War as a war of slave insurrection. They were also opportunists. They had lots of friends in the South. And in the way that Lincoln censored that newspaper in the first month or so was to order the Postmaster General to stop mailing the New York Daily News. And at that time, that was how newspapers got around the city and the country, was to mail them. So the post office wouldn't take those papers for mailing. And so Benjamin Wood took the New York Daily News and put it onto trains and ran it off to Connecticut and New York and so forth to deliver it by hand. So the War Department Detective Service went onto the trains and seized the newspapers. Can you imagine this happening today? It's inconceivable. And when Lincoln was asked about some of these decisions, which were clearly unconstitutional, and yet, he had this larger constitutional vision of what was going on, when Lincoln was asked about all of this, he said, it is a common practice to cut off an arm to save a body. It is never a good idea to save an arm and let the body die. Kind of folksy, an interesting metaphor. He'd catch a lot of heat about it today, but it was a different time. Lewis Powell testified to that comment in his trials. Booth that night, April 11th, 1865, 3 days before the assassination, went to the White House lawn with that huge mob, hoping that he could convince Powell to take a shot at Lincoln. Booth was a lot of things. He was probably, among these things, something of a coward, but got angrier and angrier as the days went on. He was engaged in the spring of 1865, however, to marry a woman named Lucy Hale, the daughter of an abolitionist senator from Massachusetts, from New Hampshire, believe it or not. He had ordered somebody an agent of his, to purchase a plot of land in Boston, because he liked Boston. He came here a lot to perform. In fact, the other night at a friend's bookshop, rare books, really high-end stuff, the kind of stuff I don't ever go near. We went in to just say hello, and we were going to have a drink and go out for dinner, and he was just putting away something that he had purchased at an auction and was about to sell, appearing for 3 nights at the Howard Athenaeum in the role of Macbeth. John Wilkes Booth, October 1863. Booth was here playing Macbeth, who of course kills the king. He was playing it on the stage that later became the old Howard Casino. And I bet there are people in this room who went there. I don't know. More than one. I should do an oral history here of the old Howard. Booth, in the early scene in the book where Booth walks out and sits down and starts talking to my Boston character, he wants my Boston character to tell him where ladies of good character can be met in Boston. Booth, of course, at that point was coming here to play Romeo and to play Richard III. Now, Lincoln's, this is an interesting little sidelight to the whole Booth Lincoln thing. And Bill O'Reilly in his book makes a lot about it. I heard him speak last week or 2 weeks ago in Miami, and he said, nobody has ever known this fact. Nobody's ever used it the way I have. John Wilkes Booth was engaged to Lucy Hale, and Lucy Hale had once dated Robert Todd Lincoln, Lincoln's son. I think that had a lot to do with why Booth, that crazy man, had finally decided to kill Lincoln. But nobody's ever put it in a book before. And I didn't have a copy. I wanted to go, hey, Bill, it's in here. I do not believe that John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln out of jealousy about Lincoln's son's relationship with his fiancée. Because there's also some question as to whether Booth was treating her seriously or not, that he might have actually been using her. Oh, and by the way, she also had dated Oliver Wendell Holmes here in Boston. It was a small world. But the whole Booth story that's as fascinating as anything, how crazy he eventually becomes, how angry he becomes. On April 10th, the morning, there's a big scene in the book that takes place on the morning of April 10th, the day that everybody learns that the war is over in Washington. And everybody piles up to the White House. And there are bands and people singing, and it was kind of an overcast April day, but as I say in the book, everyone would remember that day as having unfolded in bright sunshine. And of course, you know, the crowd could run right up to the front gates of the White House, and from where the Treasury building is over to where the old Executive Office building is, there were thousands of people. And Lincoln didn't want to come out, but the crowd gets louder and louder. The band is playing one song after another. Finally, little Tad emerges, and he looks out, and the crowd roared to see Lincoln's son, who was, I think, 10 or 11 years old at the time. And the kid's loving it. So he runs back inside, and he comes out with a flag, a captured rebel flag, and he starts waving it, and the place goes crazy. And finally, the band starts playing Hail to the Chief, and Lincoln has to come out. The kid looks up into the shadows, then steps back, and his father steps into the window. And Lincoln looks out and says, I am very happy that something has occurred that can bring such joy to the people. And then they call for a speech, and he says, well, I expect that I'll have to give a speech probably tomorrow night. And that's the speech that we've been talking about, where Booth hears Lincoln. I expect that I'll have to give a speech tomorrow night. And if I say a few words to you all now, I might dribble out all the good ideas. And somebody shouts, well, give us a dribble, Abe. And Lincoln says, no, I think here's something we'll do differently. I see that you've brought a band of music with you, and there's a tune that I like particularly. And those people across the way appropriated it illegally about 4 years ago. And the Attorney General has told me that it's our right as the spoils of war to play that song. Gentlemen, play Dixie. And when I'm traveling in my time machine, wherever it is that I happen to go, I'm going to punch in that particular date. I would just love to be there for that moment. And I've written about it in the book. One more question? Yes, sir, way in the corner.
In your research, have you ever found out when in Lincoln's life did he get this idea to eliminate slavery?
Well, it was...
First time he thought about it.
Well, as he said in his letters later, he was always opposed to slavery. He always thought it was an evil. And from the time that he was a young man. He didn't grow up in a place where there were a lot of slaves or slaveholders. He didn't have a lot of contact with African Americans of any variety. But when he saw slavery in action on that boat ride down the Mississippi when he was probably in his 20s, he wrote about it then and he wrote about it later. He said, that sight haunted me then and haunts me still. That's probably the moment that you could point to if you were looking for something like that. But it's a process. It happens intellectually and emotionally with Lincoln, and by the time he writes the Emancipation Proclamation, He may not think that slavery is going to be wiped out entirely, but it's coming. You know, he had tried in 1848. He had tried to when he was a congressman, or eradicate slavery in the District of Columbia. That one didn't pass then. He didn't believe that it was quite right that slaves should be held in pens on Pennsylvania Avenue within sight of the Capitol, but they were. The Eastern Market, or the Central Market, which you'll see in the book, was right there at 7th or 8th Street, right across the street from the National Hotel, and these people were held out in the open to be auctioned off in the rain and the snow and the heat, with the Capitol staring right down at them. He thought that was wrong, but interestingly, 12 years later, he's the president. 14 years later, the Senate and Congress passed the eradication of slavery in the District of Columbia, the one place that they have control over. And they put the bill on Lincoln's desk in April 16th or April 15th of 1862. And it sits there on Lincoln's desk. He doesn't sign it. He doesn't sign it because he's still trying to convince the border states, the states that have not yet gone out of the Union, that they can accomplish the eradication of slavery without warfare. Compensated, gradual, and voluntary were his three objectives to eliminate slavery at this point. $300 a head. The federal government will pay for every slave that you free. And he didn't, that's what he was hoping for. And so he was concerned about signing an emancipation in the district and giving them, in those states that he was trying to keep in the Union, Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, giving them some greater cause for fear. Don't forget, slavery was the cornerstone of the American economy, not just the Southern economy. The largest capital holding in North America in 1860 and 61 was not represented by the textile mills of Massachusetts or the 20,000 miles of railroad line that had been laid from here to Chicago and beyond. It was represented by the 4 million people held in bondage in the South and in the border states. And Lincoln was concerned about signing and spooking the border states. He was also worried about, well, if I free all the slaves in the district, I have certain friends who might lose some money somewhere along the way. He admitted that to somebody. And then Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts went to the office and said, "Mr. President, do you know who the largest slaveholder in Washington is on this day?" Lincoln said, "No, who?" And Sumner said, "It is yourself, sir. You hold the fates of 3,000 black men and women in your hands." And on that day, Lincoln signed the emancipation of the slaves in the district. And that's like the beginning of the process that will, 6 months or so later, lead to the Emancipation Proclamation. That's why I began the book with that scene. Lincoln has just signed it, and he's looking out the window of the War Department as the blacks are going through the street singing and celebrating this news. And he says to my main character, "When I signed the Emancipation, I did not rescind the curfew against Negroes on the streets after 10 o'clock. There's always a double-edged sword with Lincoln in these things. And while he is the great emancipator and deserves it, approach him as a man and a politician, and you'll have a greater understanding of it.